Welcome to the Who Cares About That video podcast. On today's episode, we're going to spotlight a member of our SOM community. Today's guest, I know very well, but for those of you that don't, Tim Shea has worked for Yale for 30 years and with SOM for 9 for the executive programs. Now, that's just his day job. In his spare time, he's found a way to be an all-around handyman, banana bread baker extraordinaire, and an author. Welcome to the podcast, Tim.
Thank you so much for the kind introduction, Enoch. It's really a privilege to be here with you.
Now, I want to apologize for putting you on blast. You're probably going to get inundated with a bunch of requests for banana bread. It's really good. But we're here to talk about your book, Big Man, A Journey from Mississippi to Hollywood, which you co-wrote with Willie Harris, an African-American man in the Jim Crow South era. And his journey takes us through his life. So tell us a little bit about the book and how you got to meet Willie.
Thank you very much. So really it all started in February 2016. I was driving to work here at Yale, and I was listening to NPR, and they have this feature on NPR called StoryCorps. And what they do on StoryCorps is they highlight 1 or 2 people to talk for 2 or 3 minutes about something very important that happened in their lives. And I was listening, and it was Black History Month. It was February 2016, and Willie Harris was on with his friend Alex Brown. Now, both of these gentlemen were founding members of the Black Stuntmen's Association in Hollywood in the 1960s and 1970s. And like most people, I'd never heard of the Black Stuntmen's Association. And they were talking about what they had to do to try to get work as stuntmen in Hollywood when the system was set up so that they could not get any work in Hollywood. And that's obviously extremely interesting. And then the conversation turned to Willie talking about growing up in the Jim Crow South, picking cotton in Mississippi on a plantation. And as soon as I could hear his voice and hear what he was saying about his life, I knew that he had an unbelievable American story of struggle, sacrifice, and triumph, and that this story had to be told. And the episode was only 2.5 minutes long. That's just how compelling Willie was. And so I found his name and phone number, and I called him up, and we immediately hit it off, and he said, let's do this. And so that started really a 5-year journey of writing this book together. And we started off by putting a contract together with him and I so that we would split any kind of royalties that would come through. And I said to him, do you want me to just write the book that's just about your life? Or would you like me to write a book that is more all-encompassing? So it's about your life, but it's about all the people in your life and what they struggled with and what was going on in the country at the time, in the 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, all the social issues that were impacting what was happening to you. And he said, let's go big and let's make it broad. So I initially started interviewing him, and I spent many hours on the phone with him, and I recorded every single interview, which I'm so thankful that I have 40 hours of interviews of Willie speaking, and he had such an amazing voice and presence and story.
And a piece of him.
Yes.
You still have like a little piece of Willie.
Yes.
That you carry.
And he turned me on to his family, his friends, people he knew throughout the years, and I ended up interviewing about 40 people. And then I did a ton of research into the Jim Crow South, into what led to the conditions in America of intense discrimination, not only in the South, but everywhere else, and what happened when he got to Hollywood and his time in Chicago. So I really, schooled myself on everything that was around his story.
So it almost sounds like the book is predominantly about Willie, but you also use it as a timepiece for the era.
Yeah, I really would like to think of it as sort of half biography, half book about African American history in the second half of the 20th century. And so his story is the thread that goes all the way through the book. But we meet so many other characters and hear so many other interesting things that you really get, I think, a pretty full picture of what he went through, and not only what he went through, but why. What were the conditions that caused this?
So let's get into this. Let's jump into the book. The theme of the book, at least in my opinion, or in my interpretation, it illustrates how people of color are often seen as tools and not human beings, or less than their white counterparts. And the book does a good job of taking you through Willie's journey in his young life, and how his parents, his young journey as a sharecropper, and how the plantation owner pretty much used Willie's body to produce. And he describes it as he was worked from sunrise to sundown. Then the book revisits it again when in Willie's adult life, when he joins the Air Force and becomes a basketball player for his regiment, and how he was used again. His body was used over and over again to the deterioration of his own body. So with that, what do you think continues to enable our society to perpetuate these inequalities even after 50 years of the civil rights movement?
Well, you're very perceptive, first of all, Enoch, because when you talk about Willie's body being a tool, that's very similar to the way I think about sort of the underlying theme of the whole book. And I didn't start out to write the book this way. I really went into writing the book with an open mind. I listened to that 2.5-minute StoryCorps podcast, and I knew so little about Willie and his experience, and I just wanted to just soak it all in and learn. And so after interviewing him dozens of times and dozens of other people, the one thing that kept coming up, even if it wasn't stated, it was clear to me, was this feeling of being less than, and being less than the white people simply because of the color of your skin, and having fewer opportunities, and being put in dangerous situations for no other reason than the color of your skin. And so that theme of being less than, and how unbelievably maddening that is for anyone, really permeates the whole book. And it's only because that's what I kept hearing. But to answer your question about how the system of inequality that we have.
And the reason why I even asked you that question, I have my own answers or my own thoughts of what I think it is. I think a big part that perpetuates that is education. And in the book, when you're going through Willie's life, working as a sharecropper in his young life, his mother had the option of either putting him in school or continuing to sharecrop. And I think that was a way that they perpetuated this system of inequality, is by denying that access of education to African Americans. That's just what I think. I would love to know what, as you were listening straight from Willie, what you took from it.
Well, yeah, I mean, you're 100% correct about that. So the way the school system worked in the South during Jim Crow was that children of black families, their black schools, they would start class in mid-October or whatever random day when the crop was finally in for the haul, because the harvest was in September and October. And then they would end in April or May, when they had to start working the fields for the next year's crop. Now, the white schools, they were open traditional beginning of September to end of May, beginning of June. And it was just understood that this goes back to what you were saying about being tools, that the black students would only be in school for about 6 months out of the year, and they'd be working the other 6 months. Well, they'd be working the whole 12 months, and that the white students would be in school all year. And So if you look at the people who were running the system, which were plantation owners and the white people who ran the towns, they did not want any black children to receive an education, because if they receive an education, they're not going to continue to work in the fields. And if they're not going to continue to work in the fields, they're going to have to leave the South during the Great Migration, because there aren't any jobs for very few people to begin with, but certainly for any educated black people. So they would have to leave anyway. So a lot of it is simply maintaining this caste system that had been around since black people were dragged to our shores beginning 400 years ago, maintaining the caste system through a lack of education, which, that was, you weren't allowed to teach someone, a slave, how to read. It's the same kind of thing. And we're talking about 100 years after slavery ended.
Yeah.
So the truth is, when you think about everything I just said, our country was really founded on inequality and exclusion, not on freedom and equality.
That's a good point. The other thing I noticed about the book, and I really wanted to talk about, because I personally was afflicted by it, it's the trauma. The trauma that Willie went through growing up in Mississippi as a youth, and in particular with police. We know now that back in the Jim Crow era, the police departments were the instrument that was used to continue to perpetuate white supremacy. And the way they did that was with unjust arrest and maintaining the discriminatory social rules that were in place in the South. Tell us a little bit about Willie's interactions with police authority in that time, and in particular, the sheriff that he knew in Mississippi.
Sure. So I think, living in a state like Connecticut, which is densely populated, it's hard to sort of imagine what it's actually like to live in a rural area in the South. Because even if you lived in rural Connecticut in Durham, you're still 10 minutes from a fairly decent sized city. So Holmes County, where Willie grew up, was a county of about 800 square miles. And in those 800 square miles, there were 3 police officers who controlled the entire county. So they could really do whatever they want. And one of them was Sheriff Dick Byrd, and he had 2 deputies. And Sheriff Dick Byrd was notorious, and he was actually called to account by a woman named Hazel Brandon Smith, who was the first woman to ever win the Pulitzer Prize in journalism. Willie knew her, and she lived in his town. And Sheriff Dick Byrd had shot a young black man who had been running away from a scene. And when I say running away, it's because the sheriff showed up and he told everybody, get the hell out of here. So they all just started running. And just for fun, Sheriff Dick Byrd shot him in the back. And he didn't kill the young man, but it was just an example of the way he operated. And Willie did not, fortunately for him, have a lot of run-ins with law enforcement, because he's very proud person, very he was the alpha male. Everyone enjoyed being around him. He was very charismatic, but he was very smart and he was very savvy, and he wasn't going to put himself in a position where he knew what the outcome would be. And part of that is the way his mother trained him not to be submissive, which is very difficult for someone like Willie, who's so gregarious and so proud, to be submissive around white people and to be submissive around the sheriff.
That almost sounds to me too like the talk. And the talk we discussed in the last episode, Jordan referred to the talk, which was a way that parents, and when we talk about trauma, I really wanted to get into how trauma is transferred generationally. So the talk basically is when a parent sits down with their child and explains to them the rules of engagement when dealing with police. And I'm interested to know, did your parents ever have a similar conversation with a talk where they talk to you about how you should interact with police officers? Because from my experiences, this is a very Black, Latino, people of color phenomenon. Did your parents ever have that talk with you?
No, nothing even remotely like that. I mean, I think if they were to say anything about the police, they would just hope that I wouldn't get arrested for doing something stupid. but there was no fear that I would be arrested because of who I am. And I don't think any of my white friends in Brantford, their parents ever had that talk with them either. So it's definitely not something that we're familiar with personally.
Yeah. So it sounds like Willie's mom had this talk with him, which allowed him to be very careful and calculated when dealing with the authorities back then.
Yeah, but what you have to remember is that the talk that you're talking about today, it probably, I'm guessing, has more to do with police. The talk that black children received in the South wasn't, police was just a small part of it, because I said that was almost one of the least important parts of it, because I said there were only 3 police officers in the 800 square mile county of Holmes. And so the talk was about how to deal with white people and how to be submissive around white people and make sure you get off the sidewalk when a white person is coming toward you on the sidewalk, and make sure that you never, as a black male, ever look a white woman in the eye, or else what happened to Emmett Till might happen to you. Emmett Till was the exact same age as Willie and was killed just an hour north of where Willie was living when Willie was 14 and Emmett Till was 14.
So he remembered it clearly.
So one thing Willie would say to me about the police was, it didn't really matter if there were any police around or not, because the white people were the police. They controlled everything. And if they saw you, they could just basically hold you and then call the sheriff and say, hey, I got this N-word, why don't you come get him because he was doing this or doing that. And just back to Dick Bird for a moment. So as I said, Willie was very smart and very savvy and steered clear of any trouble. But a couple of his friends got picked up by the sheriff for not doing anything, and they got thrown in prison, not prison, in jail for the night. And the sheriff went up to the 3 of them and said, what do you guys want for dinner, bologna or chicken? And 2 of them were smart enough to say bologna, and the 3rd one said chicken. And so the sheriff took out his nightstick and hit him in the head and said, God damn it, there's a drumstick. So that kind of like juvenile middle-aged humor coupled with violence just really shows the depravity of the man and the complete lack of any sort of regard for another human being.
Yeah, and it almost sounds like, these institutions of authority were really, they weren't there to protect and serve. It was really it was more corruption, because the book even goes into talking about how Dick Bird pretty much controlled all the
bootleggers.
The bootleggers and all the businesses, black-owned businesses, they had to kind of pay him off as well, just for protection almost. It was a very mob-like sort of relationship with this sheriff and the community, and in particular, even more worse with the black community. It's amazing to hear that all these stories coming from Willie, and you were able to give us some actual audio. You said you captured a lot of audio of Willie. So we're going to hear, in his own words, Willie describing a little bit about himself.
From sun up to sundown. It wasn't no certain hour. Sun up to sundown. As long as it was light, you worked. I started helping my mom them chop cotton when I was 6 or 7. You get up in the morning and go out in the cotton field, and it's wet from the night's dew, and that cotton is over your head. And it would be cold too, but you had to do it.
I used to watch my stepfather and my mother. They worked all year long, and come to the end of the year, they didn't get anything. The man told them that they owed money instead of getting money.
The most money we getting from sharecropping was $460 for a whole damn year.
We went to school. We wasn't supposed to go to school. The man didn't want us going to school because he knew if you got any type of education, you wasn't going to accept that for a long period of time. We'd go to work in the morning time and change over to school clothes and go to school and come back and go back to work. The only day we didn't work was on a Sunday.
The teacher was black. They would talk about the only 2 ways to get you out of there, being a musician or playing sports was the 2 easiest way to get out. The education was the 3rd way to get out. And they would tell you about their parents and how some of the people that they knew got out. And I would listen, because I was very miserable and angry when I was growing up. What I couldn't figure out is how you go to church, you're Baptist, whether you're black or white, you pray to the same God, but this God tells you if you're white, you're better than us. I could never figure that out. Because I used to ask my mom, What did we do for God to hate us so bad? And she would tell me that it wasn't God, it was the people. The white people would pick on you, and they would say, come here, nigga, fetch me this or fetch me that. And you know, you may be sitting there talking to somebody, and they would say, hey, nigga boy, come over here. And it was just plain humiliation. And you better not say anything. You better smile and say, yes, sir, mister. And you were just completely handicapped. And I was just boiling with rage that one of these days I'm going to get my opportunity to whoop one of these white dudes' ass. You have to be careful because you can get killed quick, and it's not your fault. My mom was afraid for me that I was the one that would speak out because she thought that if I didn't get out of there, I might wind up being killed. It really wasn't about the police in a lot of cases because the white people was the police. I never forget, he said, nigga, are you calling me a lie? And he went under the counter and he got a gun and he reversed the chambers and put a bullet in there and said, I'll blow your damn brains out. I will not survive staying here. I got to get out of here. I don't know when or how, but I got to go.
That was some powerful stuff. In his own words, I like the picture though, the image of him with Michelle Obama. When was that?
So that was in 2012. And Willie, in his later years, he lived in Las Vegas, and Michelle Obama was visiting Las Vegas for a political event. And Willie knew some of the folks who were putting that together. And so he attended, and then he was always promoting the Black Stuntmen's Association. And so he got word to Michelle Obama that he was the president of the Black Stuntmen's Association. And she said, oh, what's that? I never heard of it. So he had 5 or 10 minutes with her to talk to her and to tell her all about it. And I actually sent her an early copy of the book when Willie was still alive. And she very nicely mailed me back a couple of photographs of her and her family that she signed for Willie. And so I sent them to him. So that was very nice.
Wow, wow. I want to sort of fast forward a little bit and kind of gloss over some of the stuff that happened, like we kind of covered before, during his service with the military. But then finally, when he gets to California and his role in creating the Black Stuntmen Association.
Sure. So when he got to he was in California already in 1967 because he was stationed in California. That was his last base in the Air Force, was in California, just outside Los Angeles. And he was discharged in 1967. And by that time, he was already starting to feel some of the effects of what the military doctors had done to him. So he's in California, he's looking for work, and he's talking to a woman, and she says, hey, I know this guy, Calvin Brown. He's a Black stuntman, and he's in this group. Maybe you want to talk to this guy. Because Willie was athletic, he was tall, he was charismatic, And so it was really just a chance meeting. Through this intermediary, he met Calvin Brown. And so Calvin Brown was the first Black stuntman in Hollywood, period. And he first started working in 1963 in a movie called Drums of Africa. That was the first movie that ever featured a Black stuntman or woman. And the Black Stuntman Association was founded by Eddie Smith and by Ernie Robinson. And then shortly after they started it is when Willie met Calvin Brown, and there were already about 10 guys in the group. So Willie he didn't found it, but he was one of the early members within the first few months of its forming. And so what they did was they were all ex-military, ex-athletes, people who really just wanted to work. For them, it wasn't so much about, at least initially, about civil rights and about getting jobs for blacks. They wanted jobs, period. They wanted to work to feed their families in the movie industry. And so they would start out as extras, but they knew that, with an extra, you're gonna make $100 a day, and as a stuntman, you're making $1,000 a day. And so, like a lot of industries in the United States, especially small ones, the people who control the industry, they try to really control it. And so the stuntmen were actually all, at this time, mostly all kind of cowboys. And I say that because in the 50s and 60s, most of the action movies that were made were Westerns. So they needed cowboys to be the stuntmen. So you had families of white cowboys who controlled the stunt industry. And they didn't let anybody else in. And so you'd have a situation where you'd have a stuntmen's union, and the studios would only hire people from the stuntmen's union, and the stuntmen's union was all white, so there was no way for them to get work. So they fought and fought and fought. They trained themselves. They went to court. They really would not give up. And it was really an amazing success story because many of them went on to become hugely successful stuntmen, doing stunts for all the top Hollywood actors in the 60s, in the 70s and 80s, really. And they're in the Smithsonian now. And if you go in the Smithsonian Institute, the Smithsonian Museum of African American History and Culture, in the Black Hollywood exhibit, there's 3 or 4 pieces of Black Stuntmen's Association gear, and there's a whole write-up about them and everything. Yeah. So it's really an amazing story. And he became the president after he could no longer work as a stuntman because his knees had finally given out, and he broke his back doing stunts as well. Yeah. But so what he transitioned to then was the mouthpiece. So he would be the one to go to the studio. He would be the one to go to the advertising agency, because there's a lot of discrimination in advertising agencies too. They would go to Honda and say, you know what, all of my black friends drive Honda motorcycles, but when I turn on the TV, every Honda motorcycle commercial only has white people driving motorcycles. Why is that? We drive motorcycles too. So he would have a very good eye for that kind of thing, and he was always sort of like uncovering hypocrisy. And it was really the first time, we talked before about black people being tools and being considered less than. It was really the first time that he was able to use his brain for something worthwhile, because up to this point, society just really used his body. And
it almost sounds like his journey to California is what activated this activism in him, where he felt like he needed a legacy, to leave a legacy that would open doors for people, because he knew his knees were pretty much done. He wasn't probably going to last in the stuntman industry for too long, so he had to leave. Did he ever share with you that this was something that was very important to him, the creation of this alliance or stuntmen's agency?
Oh yeah, but for him, really finding the Black Stuntmen's Association and being able to be part of it, it's kind of like when people say they found their calling. Up until this point, he the Air Force was a good thing for him. It was other than the fact that they destroyed his knees, the Air Force overall was a good experience for him because it really opened his eyes up to the world being much more diverse, and there's more things outside of Mississippi he didn't know anything about. So but he didn't have something that was like, this became his thing. This became his mission. And even up until his death, he would always keep his eye on what was happening and call people and try to intervene if he felt he could help. He was just a fighter, and that's really what he was. He was a fighter mentally, spiritually, physically.
No, it's an amazing journey, and I'm assuming it's full with, you mentioned briefly his time at in the military. He needed some allies, some white allies, because as we all know, when we're navigating through this landscape, it's hard for people of color to operate in white spaces. Did he ever share with you anything as far as allyship, any allies that he had made along the way that helped him to sort of finalize or create the foundation to some of these things that he aspired to do?
Sure. So I mean, the first 2 people who were white who he had a fond opinion of were these 2 friends that he made when he was in the Air Force, 2 hillbillies, one from Kentucky and one from Louisiana. And it really opened up his eyes, because really up until that point, he said, I hated all white people. He'd never met a white person other than Hazel Brandon Smith in Mississippi who had ever been kind to him. So he said, why, in his mind, why should I like white people? No one's ever done anything for me except put me down. But then when he met these 2 guys, they became his 2 best friends in the service. He said, oh, I see. Not everyone's bad. There are good white people out there. And then he goes to Chicago and deals with that. And then he goes to California, and he kind of finds the same sort of racism in the movie industry. But then out there, there was a movie producer at one of the major studios who really looked out for the Black Stuntman Association, always tried to, he was a white Jewish man, so he had actually, we're not too long after the Holocaust, so he knew a lot about discrimination. So he really helped them. And then Marge Krieger, who was this young white lawyer, really went to bat for them big time as a lawyer who took their case to court so that to make sure that they could get jobs as stuntmen. So yes, he absolutely had white allies along the way. But there was just, apart from that, it was really kind of the brotherhood and sisterhood, because there were two women in the Black Stuntman Association, and they really kind of stuck together and looked out for each other.
Final question, Tim. How has writing the book and the journey of Willie's life changed your perspective?
Well, I'm glad you asked, because it really has been, I'd have to say, transformative for me in a lot of ways. I mean, I'm a white kid from the suburbs of Connecticut. I've literally lived in the same town my whole life, except when I went to college. And that's sort of like my lens through which I view the world. And it was really an incredible privilege to be sort of invited into Willie's life, to have him tell me about the most heartbreaking and intimate details of what he went through. And not just Willie, but the dozens of other people who I talked to. And these are people who didn't know me, but Willie vouched for me, and he said, talk to Tim, he's a good man. And they would just tell me about the most important moments in their life. And it was really incredible, and I'm really honored that I was to be able to put in that position. But kind of what it did for me is, I think that now when I look at people, when I see people, when I consider people, I really think more about, I wonder what their backstory is. Like, what are they bringing to this moment that is a challenge for them that I don't know anything about, because I don't have those challenges. And I think it's a way that we kind of all should be treating each other. We should all be treating each other with respect. And if you see somebody who is seems to be like really upset or angry or something, I mean, you don't know what they're going through. You don't know what they had to deal with to get to that moment. So the way I look at it is, we're all here together. We're all on this sort of life journey together. Why don't we treat each other well? Why don't we look out for each other? Because what's the point of being angry at people or saying, I don't like this kind of person or that kind of person? It's just, there's nothing good for your soul in that. So let's just try to, be good to one another and do the best we can for each other.
No, it's a great book. The book is called Big Man, A Journey from Mississippi to Hollywood. You can find this on Amazon. Again, I want to thank you, Tim, for joining us today on the episode of Who Cares About That. I want to also thank all our friends at OID, Zanaya, Kristen, and everyone at OID, and our friends at Media Services for helping us put this together. I want to just remind everybody to be kind to each other, and I'll see you on the other side.